I think we can open it, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of our participants. It's really great to welcome you to a topic, discussion on a topic that I think has very much dominated the headlines, most certainly in Africa over the last couple of years, but which has been a challenge not just for the last couple of years, and that is the issue of food security. And we're couching it, of course, in the context of geopolitics, geoeconomics, and food insecurity in Africa. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Elizabeth Soteropoulos. I'm the Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs, and it's really a great pleasure to be collaborating in this webinar with the Policy Institute at King's College London, and specifically the Project for Peaceful Competition, which I will ask my partner in crime on this initiative, Sir Oliver Letwin, to also talk to you a little about. Just a couple of things, obviously, about the discussion this afternoon. You know, we often in the narratives these days talk about the fact that the world is in a polycrisis, and that is because not only do we have the challenges that may have operated in silos in the past, but they're all coming together today to create huge challenge that we all have to grapple with. Many of the countries that face food insecurity in Africa are the very same ones that have challenges around debt. They're also the ones that are at the front line of the worst effects of climate change. And they're also, in many cases, countries that are dealing with conflict. And all of those are interrelated. And to add to all of these conditions, we have the geopolitical fragmentation, geopolitical polarization and tension, which has exacerbated some of these issues, both in terms of access to food, prices, and of course, global supply chains. If we look at the state of food security and nutrition in the world report, the 2023 one, 42% of the world's population were unable to afford a healthy diet in 2021. And those are really magnified in the continent, in Africa. And we've still not recovered from the COVID pandemic in terms of the number of people that are facing food insecurity today. And I think coupled with that, and that speaks to the issue of prices and food commodity markets and so on, 16 countries have implemented 23 food export bans, and 8 have implemented 15 export limiting measures. All of these, I think, contribute to make a situation that is quite volatile, quite dangerous in the broader context also of the fight in the continent for greater socioeconomic development and peace and good governance. So this is the framing in which this conversation will take place. I'll be introducing our speakers after Sir Oliver has made his opening remarks, but I'm really looking forward to a really fascinating discussion on a topic that is absolutely crucial to the continent. So let me introduce Sir Oliver Letwin, who heads the policy, the Project for Peaceful Competition at the Policy Institute, and it's been really, just to say, it's really been great working with you, Oliver, on this. I think it's a very pertinent and relevant topic. So thank you for the opportunity, and let me hand over to you for a few remarks.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I can be very brief. I'm first of all to thank Saya very much indeed for hosting this webinar, and to all the participants for very kindly giving their time to it. I hope it'll be interesting. This is the final webinar in a long series, as Elizabeth knows, having participated in some of the early ones, of webinars on topics which relate to geoeconomic and geopolitical strategic rivalry. And one topic we have not covered, though many have been, is that of food insecurity. It seemed utterly appropriate that we should do so, first of all, and do so particularly in the context of the problems faced by the African continent. And I'm delighted that we're going to be hearing about that and hearing about the important role that the current rivalries play in exacerbating that one, but also perhaps to hear some illumination about how we might make these things better, which has been the purpose of all of these webinars, to try to bring to light some avenues of possible improvement in what is a very difficult world. And with that, I hand back to you, Elizabeth, for what I hope will be a fascinating seminar.
Great, thanks very much, Sir Oliver. So let me not belabor the point anymore, and let me ask Professor Thandeka and Kiwani to take the floor, so to speak, first. She's an international relations expert with a focus on political economy. She's also a former special advisor at AUDA NEPAD, and now a senior consultant at the African Union. Her remarks this morning or this afternoon will be based on a paper that she is finalizing, and which we hope to publish as part of this project. Over to you, Thandeka. Great to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Our two hosts, Ms. Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, Chief Executive of SAIA, the Right Honourable Sir Oliver Letwin, Chair of the Policy Institute, Dr. Ibrahim Mayaki, AU Special Envoy for Food Systems, and someone I am very humbled to call a mentor. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. It's my distinct honor today to give a presentation which seeks to unpack the drivers of food insecurity in Africa, as well as some of the emerging geoeconomic and geopolitical factors shaping this issue. If we calculate the challenges of climate change, the consequences of intrastate conflict and interstate conflict, health crises, poverty and hunger, the question of food security remains one of the most critical questions facing the African continent. And really, even outside of Africa, the world is witnessing in real time, in Palestine, that the multiplication of crisis and conflict is dramatically increasing the numbers of what, in my view, are shamefully called hunger-related deaths. This is what makes this topic so important and timely. Africa's state of food security is often defined, and I know this is a group of experts on the panel, so I don't need to belabor the point, on the backdrop of what's commonly called the 4 Cs: climate, conflict, COVID-19, and the cost of food. In terms of climate change has intensified the questions and the crises around food security across both Sub-Saharan and North Africa. The consequences of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the consequences of the pandemic are also adding to the question facing the continent with respect to food security, food shortages, and high prices. Climate events which destroy crops, disrupt food transport systems, and disproportionately cause crises on the continent. Refer to the fact that approximately 1/3 of the world's droughts occur actually in Africa, with the Horn of Africa, for example, currently facing a particularly serious challenge. Conflicts and crises in terms of climate change on the continent are also being severely impacted by flooding and torrential rain. Food supplies and prices are especially vulnerable to climate change challenges on the continent because of lack of resilience to climatic events, food import dependence, and in some cases, skewed government policy. The majority of Africans who live in rural agricultural and fishing communities can't even afford infrastructure to protect them from the adverse effects of climate change and weather occurring events. For example, they depend on rain to water their crops, and less than 1% of arable land on the continent is equipped with formal electrified irrigation equipment. Weather-sensitive domestic food production also results in heavy reliance on imports, with some of 85% coming from outside the continent. This will be further elaborated upon when I touch on the question of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. While food imports can provide a buffer to domestic shocks, Inflation spurred by weather shocks in regions where imports are produced not only can be, but are passed on to the consuming population. Similarly, weather events that raise the cost of transportation are also passed on. The resulting high food import costs erode foreign reserves, weigh on exchange rates, and add to what we're seeing actually definitely in South Africa, but on the continent more broadly as exponential price increases with respect to food commodities. In terms of conflict, our world today is dotted by many theaters of war and conflict. One major imperative of all these conflicts is the need to pay closer attention to some of the traditional assumptions that underpin our international system and the global order as we know it. Beyond the conflicts, there are also common challenges that confront us all with respect, as I already mentioned, with respect to climate change, the scourge of pandemics, and other factors which have impacted on the world in the past few years. This has directly posed a challenge to the global governance systems that we have in place currently, and have exposed, in many senses, the inability of these current institutions to react appropriately to both new and existential problems. Growing inequality, not only between North and South, but within regions of the world, also in relation to major demographic shifts, the integrated problems of refugees, irregular migration across international borders, as well as what I would view as declining trust in government and intergovernmental institutions, which we've seen even with respect to the UN and the AU, I think, ashamedly in some respects. While none of these problems are totally new today, the sheer scale, in my view, and the complexities are not ones that we're familiar with. And this is why our established global governance systems that have functioned relatively well in the past now appear ineffective and inadequate. In the recent past, conflicts have left at least 33 million people in 10 countries on the continent in urgent need of humanitarian assistance and displaced millions of people, further jeopardizing their food security. Conflicts are the first cause of famine. Conflicts currently on the continent, our number is 23, impacting at minimum 100 million people directly in terms of food and health. It's difficult to organize the protection of populations in a war situation. Associated military expenditure by states, which have increased on the continent by 51 billion in 2023, are actually more than 6 times higher than those envisaged by the UN statistics to improve food security throughout the world. Conflicts persist and have displaced many people on the continent, millions and millions. In the Tigray region alone in Ethiopia, an estimated 350,000 people have been displaced and are suffering from famine. And closely following that, again in the Horn, is the question of conflict-related famine in Somalia. In some cases, armed groups view hunger as an additional weapon to keep the population under their control. They prevent supplies by blocking food aid or destroying crops, livestock, and blocking sales points. I'm not going to go over details, but we can enumerate the countries where this has occurred. I was going to refer to the Central African Republic, where there is currently an acute food crisis. And that part of this food crisis is the fact that the main road between Bangui and neighboring Cameroon is cut off. And this deprives the population of access, once again, to food supplies. And as a result, in addition to that, food prices have skyrocketed. This is just one of the examples of this. The African Union, in Agenda 2063, in recognition of this, made the question of silencing the guns a clarion call to address the structural challenges and root causes of the drivers of conflict and connecting this directly to sustainable development. While the initial target of silencing the guns was at 2020, during the 14th extraordinary session of the Assembly on silencing the guns here in Johannesburg in 2020, the AU extended this period to 2030, noting that certain gains were hampered by COVID-19 and stressing the importance and interconnectedness of peace and economic development. COVID-19 has already been mentioned, exposed directly Africa's supply chain struggles and exacerbated our food security crisis. We saw during that period the world shrinking in terms of its economy by 3.5%, whereas global economy increased during the same period by 16%. The loss of income due to work connected to this cost about 4.4%, they say, of the world's GDP, and precipitated famines and malnutrition. The pandemic also highlighted the need for social shock absorbers, for not just for Africa, but in particular in Africa, in order to fight hunger and safeguard economic systems. The same questions occurred with respect to the vaccination policies that we discussed in detail in terms of Africa's access to vaccines was directly exposed during the crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, and this led to, again, a consideration that Africa would have to rethink its approach connected to this with respect to food security, in respect to supply chain struggles. In respect to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, since February 2022, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine impacted global trade, production, and consumption, and leading to what are continually sustained high commodity prices until today, which posed a risk to food security throughout the world. The Russia-Ukraine conflict affected food security and endangered, indeed, national security in Africa. With the continent's close trade, as well as diplomatic ties with both conflicting parties, the disruption to food supply chains created serious socioeconomic challenges affecting millions, and these continue. The conflict has resulted in soaring prices of wheat, sunflower, oil, crude, and has disrupted food, fuel, and fertilizer supply chains. Although this has stabilized in recent months, but it's still at crisis proportions. Russia and Ukraine are major producers and suppliers of fertilizers and staple food commodities, including maize, sunflower seeds, and vegetable oil. And the crisis caused food insecurity and instability on the continent. The Black Sea Grain Initiative, which allowed Ukrainian food exports to continue during wartime, was pulled out by Russia in 2023. And there were attempts to revitalize it, but it never happened. But even when the agreement was in place, one could argue that the benefits were questionable with respect to Africa. In 2022, the AU Commissioner for Agriculture, Rural Development, Blue Economy, and Sustainable Development, Her Excellency Joseph Asako, and Dr. Mayaki, who was then Chief Executive of AUDA-NEPAD, co-authored an opinion editorial on this question, the impact of Russia-Ukraine conflict on Africa. And I'll quote from the op-ed. It said, while Africa, and I quote, is yet to fully recover from the socioeconomic repercussions of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Russia-Ukraine conflict poses another major threat to the global economy, with major African countries being directly affected. Just within a few weeks, global wheat, sunflower, and oil crude prices have soared to unprecedented levels. Africa is heavily reliant on food imports from both countries, and the continent is already experiencing price shocks and disruptions in the supply chain of these commodities, unquote. In this opinion piece, the two leaders say what they describe, though, at the end as a silver lining, with an opportunity for African countries to think very differently and do things very differently, including more regionalized approaches to socioeconomic questions and the promotion of African self-reliance. I will return to this theme at the end. The cost of food, once again, is directly related to this matter. It's a perfect storm, actually, in many ways that we face. This food, fuel, and fertilizer crisis, which was exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, as well as the scarring effects of COVID-19, has led to soaring inflation. It's also led to rising debt in a number of African countries. Connected to this as well, with respect to climate change, extreme weather conditions, I know those in South Africa, we're actually facing the brunt of it currently, have led to unsustainably high food prices. The price of food has exploded, experiencing its highest increase in 10 years, plus or minus 40%. And this has explained the pressure of demand for a number of supplies in foodstuffs. The rise in food prices has benefited agribusiness, but small farmers have not had the opportunity to ride this high wave. They don't have the access to inputs and the fertilizers necessary for the expanded production due to the means or supply difficulties. In addition to the food crisis and the question of conflict, we have weak local infrastructure and low levels of agricultural productivity. In this respect, I think, and again, I'm going to return to this point, the pandemic also, as well as in the conflict in Ukraine and Russia, exposed us to the fact that we need to do things differently, and we need to look at the question of food security in Africa very carefully. So where to from here? Food security is a crucial aspect of enhancing the national welfare and national security of African countries. The African Union has passed a number of declarations and decisions on this question with respect to food security, nutrition security, and food systems in particular. These include the 2003 Maputo Declaration. This includes the 2009 CIRT Declaration on Investing in Agriculture, amongst others, as well as, of course, Agenda 2063, which is the development blueprint for the continent, and the intermediary goals enshrined in the Malabo Declaration on Accelerated Africa Agricultural Growth and the Transformation for Shared Prosperity and Improved Livelihoods. The COVID-19 crisis has highlighted inequalities and vulnerabilities in food systems, and business cannot continue as usual. This is an opportunity to reorient and transform food systems to become more resilient and sustainable. No country on the continent, no single organization on the continent can overcome these crises, these multiple crises alone. Collaborative and multi-sectoral actions are required urgently to avert an imminent food crisis on the continent and pave the way as well for recovery and rebuilding. The opportunity exists as well to enhance the African Common Position on Food Systems, which was developed in 2021 in preparation for the UN Food Systems Summit. It's, as I say, it's an opportunity, I think, to retune. It's an opportunity to, in many ways, revisit this common position and make it more robust in terms of addressing some of these questions collectively. The promotion of regional solutions, interregional trade, and local markets, and working on how food systems should transform to be able to cope with these types of multiple crises has been one of the cornerstones of Agenda 2063. It's exactly why the AU appointed a special envoy for food systems in the first place in 2023. I believe that the African continent in the policy space has evolved, and where there's clear recognition that poorly coordinated policies risk locking in or worsening already unsustainable inequalities, reversing hard-won gains, there is an opportunity for poverty reduction and income. The AU, in collaboration with the African Development Bank, organized a summit in 2023 in Dakar. And the summit was titled Food Sovereignty and Resilience. And this was, again, timely with respect to this question, because it was designed to galvanize global support, but actually focus on African support in terms of immediate implementation. And the Dakar 2 Food Summit, in many ways, is important and timely to address this question of rising food prices, the disruption in global food supply, and the worsening of food security on the continent. It was said that the Food Summit did mobilize investment with respect to agricultural production and food supply. The ADB seems to be leading in this respect with its own input into this. But it's just a start. I think that this kind of approach in terms of actually implementation, and often the question of implementation is where the bugbear lies. Implementation of some of these decisions and approaches is going to be critical if we're going to address this question of food security. As mentioned earlier with reference to Sako and Mayaki, the Russia-Ukraine war, like COVID-19, has demonstrated the urgency for African countries to break the cycle of dependence by growing food production proactively on the continent, and in particular supporting small-scale farmers, and especially. In the Dakar Declaration, it was agreed to allocate at least 10% of public expenditure to increase funding in agriculture. They also resolved to deploy robust production packages to boost productivity and increase resilience in terms of achieving food security and especially self-sufficiency. It's not been done, as I mentioned, it's a question of implementation, but it's a good start. And I think building upon this, hopefully will be one of the initiatives that we can look forward to completing in terms of with respect to this. We cannot overemphasize in this regard the need for a continental awakening, that it's time for Africa to feed itself and to fully unlock its agricultural potential as well to feed the world. I think I'm going to stop there, and thank you for your attention.
Right, thanks very much, Thandeka. I think you've raised a number of very important points, including the issue which I think you ended on, which is about Africa becoming much more able to feed itself rather than having a high import dependency. But also, as you said, it's about tackling some of our underlying and in many instances, really long-standing conflicts that also make the situation much worse. Clearly, as one of the participants has posted in the chat, we're not assuming that Africa is monolithic or that the solutions for one particular country or region work for others. But clearly there are a number of principles and actions, I think, which if we work on collectively as a continent would help us to reach that goal of greater intra-regional agricultural trade, of greater resilience when it comes to food security, because that's what lies at the base of that, and of course greater investment in some of these issues. That's one dimension, and the other one then really speaks to the challenges we face around climate and of course conflict. But I'm sure we'll hear some more about that from our other speakers. Thanks very much, Thandeka. Let me then move on to Dr. Ibrahim Mayaki. Dr. Mayaki, as many of you no doubt know, was the former CEO of Oude Nepad. He is also now, as of 2023, the AU's special envoy for food systems, and so that itself tells you how the AU is thinking about these challenges. And it's also really a great honor that he serves on SAIA's international advisory board as well, and we've often called on him for his guidance and advice. Dr. Mayaki, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elizabeth. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks to SAIA and the Policy Institute. Professor Nkiwane made a very comprehensive presentation tackling several issues related to food security and food systems transformation in the continent. But unusually, I would like to start by a response to a comment in the chat, and then I will go through because the response to the comment on the chat will come back in my intervention, and I didn't want to miss it. So the comment was, if I understood well, Africa is very diverse. You have very different agroecological zones, different comparative advantages. So having a continental approach is really the wrong way to go about it. Well, if India was a continent, I could say that India doesn't have a continental approach to food system transformation. But it's a country. If China was a continent, it would evidently, and it is seen in its food systems transformative approach, is taking into account the diversity that exists, the comparative advantages, the agroecological zones. So I think the issue is not there. The main issue is fragmentation. It has to be understood, is one of the main obstacles to Africa's development, quote unquote. Fragmentation in 54 countries, trying to do each country the same thing, has proven its limits. And this is why integration is important. Integration doesn't mean coming back to a minimal type of consensus on everything. It means trying to see how, with the best advantages that we have, we can frame a common approach that can help us have optimal solutions. It's evident that if you take West Africa and you want to, improve access to electricity in West Africa, if you only have national solutions, you are not reaching optimality. And the same goes for Southern Africa, Northern Africa, etc. So this is a parenthesis, but that parenthesis allows me to go to my first point. which is about the global context in which we are. I happen to be in Paris during these days, and as you all have seen, farmers in Spain, in Germany, in France went out in the streets, put pressure on their governments, and each one of these governments, Germany, France, Portugal, Spain, Italy, put pressure on the EU Commission in order to review the norms related to the interlinkages between climate change and agricultural production, which means that food issues, not only in Europe, but we see it in Europe, but all over the world, are gaining a political dimension, because farmers from South America to Asia to Europe to Africa are sensing that the policies which are imposed on them do not allow them to really or get out of poverty or reduce or increment their level, the quality of their livelihood. So there is a contestation widely regarding farmers, a contestation of a global order in which they are. They have a sentiment that they have been left behind. And I think this will have to be taken into account in the African context, because what we say in CADEP, which is the Continental Strategic Framework, is that if we don't have an inclusive approach and listen to the farmers, whether in agribusiness or the small-scale farmers, we might not be able to implement what we have decided to do in terms of productivity, production, etc. So I think this is a call which has to be taken into account. If you add to this factor the fact that there is a weaponization of food, and you mentioned, Elizabeth, in your introduction also, all the protectionist measures that are taken, which is a geopolitization of food. So if you have weaponization of food, geopolitization of food, contestation of farmers, you are moving from an issue that was very much discussed technically, how to improve productivity, how to improve production, how to get the right fertilizers, how to manage land, how to do irrigation, etc., etc. You are moving from this technical discussion to a highly political discussion, not only nationally, regionally, continentally, but worldwide. So it's important to take into account this aspect. And Tandeka, put on top of his layers all the issues of conflicts, etc., etc. So we are in a very complex situation. And in front of that complex situation, the transformation of food systems is not a technical issue, it's a political issue. So you need to have a combination between technical solution and political solutions. But we are moving towards a reflection on political solutions much more than technical solutions. We could, fill all the rooms of all the places we are with the technical solutions that have been piled up by agricultural engineers for the last 20, 50 years. The question is not there. The question is, how do we make sure that we reduce, in the case of Africa, our food import bill, which is $50 billion? How do we make sure that we integrate an accelerated urbanization that is changing diets, so that we respond properly to a population that in 2050 would be more than 50% urban? How do we make sure that small-scale farmers are transformed into micro, small, meso entrepreneurs? How do we make sure that the transformation of these small-scale farmers is in complementarity with the development of agribusiness? So these are the key questions that we need to ask. And if we want to reduce our food import bill, evidently we need to count on our own capacities to produce. Because we are in a situation today, and we don't have time to go into the details, where we are feeding some parts of the world, and these parts of the world are buying land in Africa and having great levels of productivity and production. And we are doing it with the complicity of government. So this has to be denounced. And this is a point where I insist a lot at the African Union level as special envoy. So if we want to reduce our food imports bill, increase the quality of life of our farmers in rural areas, of our citizens in urban areas, we first need to adopt a regional approach solution. And I come back to the first point I made earlier. And I mean, all the countries of West Africa cannot produce rice. All the countries of Central Africa cannot produce each of them maize. So we need to have a food basket approach, I mean, which is a regional approach, where we have a complementarity of production, taking into account the regional market. And this is the spirit of a continental free trade agreement. And then once we identify these food baskets, and they have been identified across all the regions of a continent, we can see very clearly that the increase of productivity and production will be linked to infrastructure and digitalization, etc. But infrastructure will be key. Let us not forget that our post-harvest losses are roughly 40% of our production because of lack of infrastructure. So the solutions technically exist, but politically, we need a regional approach. If politically we don't frame that regional approach, no technical solution will work. Some countries will escape that impasse. You know, some big countries might escape it. 5, 6, or 7 on 55. So we are not going to resolve the issue, and the spreading of the conflicts might be quite important. So this is about the context. In terms of responses, well, I think most of those who listen know the responses about CADEP 2003, Malabo 2014, which opened to multi-sectorality and talked about food and nutrition security, not only food security, and then open to issues of land, climate, training of small-scale farmers, extension services, etc. And now we are in post-Malabo. Malabo was 2014. We're in 2024. We need to think about post-Malabo. And the thinking of post-Malabo is based fundamentally on linking three strategies: infrastructure, trade, and agricultural development. And this is what will lead us to a higher level of food security. And there also, it's a fundamentally political dimension, because in order to integrate these three strategies, we need the right decisions regionally. We need to choose the right corridors, which are already chosen, but countries need to work beyond their border because we need transboundary projects. And this is fundamentally a political dimension issue too. My third point is about the future. Well, the big question that we are all asking ourselves in the food systems domain is, if we are lagging behind in increasing food security today with 1.3 billion people, how will we feed 2.6 billion in 2050, according to the law scenario? And we need to do it extremely in an accelerated way. Acceleration is the key factor. And this is the future that needs to be built today, and it needs to be built by strengthening the implementation of our frameworks in infrastructure, in trade, and in agricultural production. Evidently, the impact of climate change will lead to specific technical issues in agricultural productions. But I think we have built the necessary knowledge that can allow us, in combination with the farmers, have the right adapted technical solutions. But there also, governments have a role to play. And one of the key roles that they need to play is empowering all these actors. Because we are done with a strictly top-down approach. We need to go towards a top-down and bottom-up combination approach. And then we go back to Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen used to say, I mean, you don't have famine in democratic systems. If you dig a bit deeply into that, you see that it is a question of inclusivity. It will be difficult to continue framing the public policies without having a right, a sound priority on the issue of priorities. Let me end on two solutions very, very quickly. First solution that we are pushing, and we are pushing it also at the G20, because as you know, Brazil has enhanced food security as its priority during its chairing of the G20. So what we really push as a critical objective is that integration and that focus on food baskets that, given their comparative advantages, will allow within a continental free trade area to favor optimal exchanges between the regions. This is the way to go. This is the way to go. And the second solution is about funding our agricultural systems. We targeted 10% of public revenue in CAADP. Less than 10 countries have really reached that level. We need to rethink that. And rethinking means that we need to open it much more to the private sector. And when I say private sector, I include the small-scale farmers because they are the ones investing the most in Africa's infrastructure and producing 80% of the food we eat. So it's important to have mechanisms of support to the small-scale farmers so that we can have a different thinking about financing our food systems transformation. So technically, the solutions have been built for quite a long time. We need to have political solutions that can make the technical solutions work. And I will end here. And thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you, Dr. Mayaki. I think there's a lot there, but 2 points to highlight. We often know the technical solutions, they're on the table, but often the political will or the political push is not there. And I think sort of ending on the two solutions really is very powerful, particularly the point that you made about small farmers. Sometimes we think about the private sector and we think about the big agribusinesses, but actually thinking about the initiatives and mechanisms that create real opportunities for small farmers to be able to really rise up to the challenge are issues that are very important. Thank you very much, Dr. Mayaki. That was very good, and we'll pick up on some of those points, and indeed also Thandeka's in the Q&A. Let me move then on speedily to Mr. Jules Zamotti. I know that he also has a pressing engagement a little later, so we're really grateful you could make it, Jules. Mr. Amotti heads up the ICRC regional delegation here in Southern Africa. I've drawn a complete blank on the name. Sorry. I can't think of the name.
ICRC, Elizabeth.
No, I can't think of I was going to read it out, but I've gone completely blank. Anyway, I think everybody knows the ICRC by its acronym. Sorry, Jules. Let me hand over to you.
Red Cross.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I need another cup of coffee. Over to you, Jules. Thanks for making the time.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you as well, panelists and our guests. Really, all protocol observed. I'm from the ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross, and heading the ICRC regional office in Pretoria. We work in 9 countries in Southern Africa, but as by background, I came from the global ICRC response in relief and food security and livelihood across all 5 continents in the world. And today I'm just going to speak around how we see things in the conflict zones, because it's much related. And I really want to acknowledge the good introductions by Mr. Oliver and also Professor Thandeka and Dr. Ibrahim. I think it's like they read all my small presentations, because all the point I wanted to say has been said, but I would just like to focus on few elements around food insecurity in Africa related to the armed conflict and other situations of violence. And I think Dr. Thandeka said around numbers of the conflict that we are facing on the African continent. As we work mainly in the armed conflicts around the world, we see the world this year is marked by around 120 armed conflicts, all the world. And you see 120 armed conflicts in the world without counting the number of situations of violence. But we see in Africa around 35 armed conflicts, some active, some dormant conflict without any resolution, still in the process and driving a lot of issues. And I'm not going back to the figures to see all these are driving out people from their home base, from their places, being internal displaced within Africa, sometimes going as refugees outside Africa, raising a lot of problems to see how do there's people access to their land, because you cannot talk about food security without producing your own food. You cannot talk about food security without processing, without having enough storage capacities, without having ability to access to the market. And this requires a kind of income to be able to purchase if you cannot produce your own food. One thing we must know as well, conflict is driving out people from the rural areas to the cities. And the livelihood in the cities is not food production related livelihood, where we see farmers and also have been pastoralists are getting out of the areas where they're supposed to produce and to be living in the cities where they're exposed to the new, let's say, challenges, how to get a new skills to adapt livelihood to the cities. And also conflict and climate change is also forcing new complications. As you see, the change of livelihood style, we have seen it in many countries, where sometimes pastoralists are converting to the petty trade, where we see some farmers, because of the repetitive drought, they have lost their capacity to produce. They start moving to different livelihood, which is leaving a big gap. To contrast with some figures someone have been saying, explaining that Africa, I think this is in the terms of reference for this call from Saya, explaining that Africa has 60% of the world's arable land. You know, the potential is there, but we have a lot of drivers happening today, which is blocking the abilities for the African population to access the food. Now, on the ICRC International Committee of the Red Cross perspective, the main drivers of the food insecurity that have been said, they concur. One is the conflict situations of violence. I'm not going to break them down because they have been said. The effect of climate change is coming loudly combined with the armed conflict, and then increasing vulnerability and the dysfunctioning food systems. I think just Dr. Ibrahim has broken it down, and also with some perspective on how to better fix this. I think they are coming very loudly. And the other thing as well is a very poor application of policy promoting food security, nutrition, livelihoods, and sustainable environment for the African, because we know that we see the desertification coming from the north to the south. Today, if you see the Sahel is losing a lot of land every year, and this is impacting on the ability to produce and to sustain food security in all these areas. Now, back to the ICRC. If I may say, we see things on the international humanitarian law perspective. Then we have three kind of our approach when it comes to food security issues. One is respect of international humanitarian law. What does it mean exactly? The better the humanitarian law, international humanitarian law is respected, then it will contribute for those taking part in the hostilities to reduce the risk of food insecurity, food starvation, and risk of famine. We can see in many contexts today when IHL is not really respected, the risk is too high. I don't like to name some contexts. We see what is happening in the media, where just a lack of respect of IHL is exposing millions of people in the risk of starvations of famine. This is one. Respect IHL, international humanitarian law. And the second approach we apply within the ICRC is address point of disruption. Addressing point of disruptions means at local, regional, and global food systems to strengthen the resilience. Today, the world has a big village. We eat things that are produced in Eastern Asia. This requires transportation, all this logistics supply chain to get food, sometime in the conflict zones where we see across Africa, the capacity to produce have drastically reduced. Therefore, people are depending on the importation of foods. And this also, when the war happened in any side of the world, it impacts on the fuel price, therefore increasing the cost per unit of foods, which is a problem to be addressed. The third one is best fitting support to individuals and groups. Why this one? Because we have different individual needs or community needs to sustain our food security and nutrition. When you are exposed to the malnourished, you are not treating community, you are treating individual case. And then we adapt our responses to community or individual case depending on the level of vulnerability. Now, how do we do it? Just to give a practice. There are two best practices that we try to implement that people know well. One is, I think, a Chinese proverb, I want to quote it, saying, give a man a fish, he will eat for a day. Teach a man to fish, he will eat for a lifetime. This is one thing. The other thing as well, I read from one of the big scholars. I think this is Randy Shaw said, grow what you eat, eat what you grow. It's very important. In many places in Africa, we eat what we don't grow, or sometimes we grow what we don't eat. And this is also contributing sometimes to food insecurity. Now, using these two codes, it drives us to see our responses in three terms. In short term, because conflict raises a lot of vulnerabilities, malnutrition, lack of food, starvation, risk of famine. As part of short term, we go to the emergency response. The emergency response is where we provide direct food aid to allow those who are in food insecurity to meet their direct needs. But also we see on the mid-term approach, which is to support those communities, those who can, to produce their own foods. And this is very important because humanitarian aid is the most expensive today. It's become most expensive because when you have to feed someone, we're talking about 100 million. If you see you have to feed 100 million, and then you divide just 100 million, taking an average size of the family in Africa of 5 people. And our estimation in the humanitarian standard suggests that a family of 5 people needs, at least for normal diet monthly, around 100 plus US dollars on the monthly basis just for the basic food. Now you times it for hundreds of millions, and this goes for billions of responses, dollars needed, that we failed to mobilize in real time because it's not easy. Therefore, combining with the production system to cut the humanitarian cost and to be able to help people as well to maintain a kind of dignity by producing their own foods, combining with what they can receive as aid. Now, when we came to the production, we see at 4 levels. One is around supporting the agriculture production, supporting livestock as well, supporting income generating activities, but also building the capacities, building capacities because sometimes you cannot even only producing through farmers, but you see you strengthen the capacities of the line ministries like the ministries of agriculture and extended services, livestock as well, etc., to be able to provide the services. Because we have been seeing in many areas, there's ministries when the non-state armed groups are operating in their specific areas, the state services do not access those areas. And now we have to broker between the two and to provide services that the state cannot provide, which is why we interact on this one. And in long term, it consists of strengthening the community resilience and also see how we can contribute to restore food system, which is very heavy, has already developed by Dr. Ibrahim. I really appreciate all this program that he said around the initiative from the AU, as well as the professor said it before. I think there are a lot of, initiative that is there. But we would like just to highlight a few things around the humanitarian perspective. One is to see today how we can empower women economic capacities, because most of the countries in Africa, the livelihoods today in many countries, women are playing a key role to feed the children, to look for livelihood, to look for food in their houses. And then we have women must be part of the solution. The second point has raised by, I think, Dr. Ibrahim is also as well, around entrepreneurship program. We have small-scale farmers who must be empowered as well. And then to see who can come in partnership, which is also one of the long-term solutions, to see private sector, development actors, bank as well, to see how we can combine our capacities to make it. And research organizations as well is efficient, because today you cannot have advanced agriculture or production across Africa without connecting with the research organizations to see what are the efficient, let's say, post-harvest, monitoring system, post-harvest technologies that can be applied to better keep or store what has been produced or to process them, because sometimes in many countries in Africa we have seen the problem is not about production. The problem is around processing. The problem is storage capacities. The problem is in infrastructures to move food from the production zone to the consumption zone. And this needs road, needs public infrastructures that humanitarian we cannot provide because it's not in our abilities and the funding is too huge, needs some good responses. Now, reflections, some reflections, personal reflections, just to complete what others have said. I see 4 points that can contribute as well to sustainably address food system in Africa. One is peace and security across Africa. Silencing the gun initiative from AU was one of the best, but we need this to continue because if, let's say, 2/3 of Africa is in war or affected by armed conflict and other situations of violence, how do we expect to better feed African populations with people on move, their refugees, their migrants, their displaced population? I think the security stability can be one of the key drivers for food security. Second one is well-regulated, I call it interdependencies between states first. And this is what I think Dr. Ibrahim was calling regional integration. That must be there. State must not be opposing to themselves because if the neighboring states are not really combined together, how can they expect to address food insecurity for their own population? But again, within the same state, we see sometimes entire community clashes between farmers and pastoralists. And this need a kind of interdependencies to transform the food production to be the shared business where everyone can see the added values. If I'm a pastoralist, I need to depend on what the farmers can produce to help me during the rain season to feed the livestock as well, and vice versa. I think they are kind of interdependency, but the other thing as well is on the financial inclusion. We saw many farmers are not even financially included. They don't have loan, they don't have investment, they don't have bank, they don't have access to the loan to help them even investing in their small-scale farming. This is one of the areas to improve. And the last point we were thinking about, we started some few projects, I think, in Ethiopia, and then we have the word integrate, where it's called index insurance for farmers and pastoralists to see how to have like kind of insurances. Because if we are talking about drought, climate change, and people, sometimes they lose all their investment, their productive asset. Is there no any insurance services to say how do they compensate to the loss? And this goes back to the humanitarian responses free of charge. But for the longer term solutions, I think we must be very innovative. I'd like to finish by showing Africa not has only a problem, but raising some opportunities. I see too many areas. If you see as Africa having 6% of the world arable lands, which means we have abilities to produce more, and to take it has opportunities for more investment for the time being, has already said by the others. This is a big potential for the world. Produce more in Africa to feed Africa and then sell, make agriculture business as the core source of GDP in Africa, because today it's mainly depending on the mining resources and other sectors, and agriculture is not really perceived as the engine of the business or economic growth of Africa. And the last point is the growing population in Africa, has said again by my predecessors, 2.6 billion of people to be fed by 2050. And that will represent 25% of the world population living in Africa. How can we transform this African population to really human asset? Not just depending, but educating well, improving health system, because if you are sick, even you cannot produce, you cannot do anything. I think the transformation of African social fabric will be also very important. And the last one will be also, Africa is the growing market for the future. Having 2.6 billion of consumers give more opportunities for the future. Therefore, investment in the food security must come to Africa because there are many potentials existing on the continent. Thank you again for listening to my long speech.
Great. Thank you very much, Jules, and sorry about my my brain freeze there. I think the one question which really speaks directly to the geopolitics and geoeconomics, of course, and I'm sure people will it'll come up in the discussion, is really, I think, the challenges that we're facing in this fragmented global system in terms of respect of international humanitarian law, and what that then means for a lot of the work that the International Committee actually does on the continent. Thank you very much. I know you will probably have to slip out at some point, but thanks very much for making the time. Let's then now, we've had 3 presentations that really are very much embedded in Africa. We're now going to move to some of the continent's partners, and I'd like to ask Dr. P.K. Anand, who's a visiting fellow at the Research and Information Systems for Developing Countries, RIS, which is a long-standing partner of the Institute, to take us through his presentation. He will also look specifically at some of the issues that India pioneered in the context of its G20 presidency last year. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. And I would appreciate many points which previous speakers have already spoken. For instance, the issue to reduce conflicts in Africa raised by Mr. Jules. I recall that during G20 India presidency, what our Prime Minister had said, this is not the era of war. And similarly, there are many other world leaders who had also spoken on this issue of conflicts. The number of conflicts has also been raised. So that's one area. If peace is there, and since the organization looks into peace aspect also, becomes very, very, very focal, very central kind of it. Next slide. I would like to add here that when we talk in terms of this issue, the larger context is we have gone through G20 presidencies of the past, and we are also aware that today South Africa and India both are Troika members, and with Brazil as the presidency. So broadly, the term which is being used over the years is food security and adequate nutrition. We have seen that during the COVID times, to be very frank, nutrition was relegated to a very, very small attention. Idea was that if people are starving, how to provide them food grains. So eventually that has increased the load on undernutrition, and especially in Africa as well as in Asia. When we started in RIS on G20 preparations about 2 years back, what we felt that when we talk in terms of transfer of technology from, say, developed countries to developing countries, India should also be prepared to share its technologies with countries, say, of Africa. And one area which came in our DG was very emphatic that research and awareness on millets should be given a push. We are happy to see that in one form or another, this was included as one of the documents in the leaders' declaration. And notwithstanding the conflict, notwithstanding the differences in opinion, eventually the G20 leadership rose to occasion, and something was agreed upon. The best part, which I feel in my personal view, is that African Union was taken on board. It was overdue, but its time had come far earlier. But anyhow, it came to this table. And of course, G20 is not limited to the 20 countries, but still with the inclusion of AU, a lot can be directly looked into by G20 and for Africa. Now, if I look into, say, Human Development Index and multidimensional poverty, we do have variables like, say, education and health. Today, if you have a look at multidimensional poverty, there are 10 indicators, and the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, they look into it, and they have given, say, 10 indicators. When we were doing some research in RIS, I wrote a paper with my friends over here in agriculture team, and we added some more variables. The one variable which we added was access to public distribution system. And this we added as under one category, survival support, because this is a survival support. It is not there today in MDP globally, but we gave a modified MDP by including it. And here we were not limited only to, say, food grains, but some nutritive items. In India today, we distribute pulses, for instance. Now, if this kind of emphasis is not given, especially on nutrition, then when we talk in terms of, say, human capital, we cannot reach an optimal situation for any country. I take you now beyond the context. And if I see the status of food insecurity and undernutrition, and since other speakers are giving some numbers, I'll confine to very few numbers. But one is that 1/6 of the global population resides in Africa. Especially 3/5 of the young are in Africa. So when we talk in terms of the coming years, a number has been given on 2050 population to be higher by, say, 2.6 billion. So it becomes all the more important for the world as a whole to give more emphasis on food security in Africa, especially not only just to come at a time of, say, crisis to give some aid. That's not the idea. Now, that's a very short-term arrangement. But what I feel, we need to invest so that the capacity which is there, the arable land which is there, it is unlocked. And Africa has the potential to become a granary for the world by creating, say, export surplus and coming out of what we generally call subsistence farming. So that is the idea. Unless we do it, it will be difficult. I would like to appreciate one thing about researchers from Africa. They have done n number of studies on undernutrition, stunting, wasting, and underweight. I've been reading these studies over the last few months. And one method, which is called under logistic regression, proportional populations ordered model, has been profusely used for, say, Ethiopia, for a town in Ethiopia, for East African countries. And when we all recall what was said, that Africa is very diverse. So when we talk in terms of East Africa is also diverse. So there is some clustering when you move from one country to another, and how well these researchers handle that. That's also very commendable. I think many of these papers are worth reading.
Dr. Anand, your slides aren't moving. I don't know if you want us to share. You've just got the title slide. And if I can ask you to put it on slideshow.
On my screen, these are moving. Oh, just a second.
If I can ask you also to, I'm just looking at the time. If you can.
Which slide can you see now?
No.
Which slide you are able to see now?
I'm just the title. So you need to put it on slideshow, and then you need to move to the slide that you're on. Otherwise, perhaps you can just remove it and just speak to the slides. I think that might also help with time, with managing time.
Okay.
Okay, now we can see it. Okay.
Well, now you can see. That's fine.
Okay, good.
Now, when we talk in terms of G20 presidency, the idea of one Earth, one family, one future. So it's not that countries look, and we are talking in terms of geopolitics and geoeconomics also. So if certain countries, say, have a geopolitics like how to create a situation to export more food grains into, say, Africa, and as a quid pro quo to buy, say, minerals or maybe some non-food products like say cocoa or coffee, things like that. So I think that kind of thinking changes the terms of trade, the real terms of trade across the commodities. So that tendency is coming up, and it creates a lot of problems for the small farm holders in Africa. So that needs to be checked into. One thing which was accepted by the G20 presidency was the Deccan High-Level Principles on Food Security and Nutrition. I'll just mention one or two here. I'll be giving one slide later on. The very first one is on humanitarian aid to the vulnerable societies. So that's what is, I think, the crux of many of the speakers on this aspect was similar. And the agriculture ministers meeting also had emphasized on things like that. So I think this is sort of the direction in which one can think of moving. But then the issue comes that, yes, it's fine that we should do all these things. How can G20 help towards achieving all these principles? So one area is, say, on financing, and one is to start with, if I look at, say, supply chain disruptions. We all know that during the COVID period, when the global supply chains were much stressed, within the nations, from the rural areas to the urban areas, food supplies were not stressed to that an extent. If we have a look at the number of people who had, say, the number of starvation deaths were not there. I recall in one of the meetings, there was IFPRI was in a meeting on webinar, IFAD was there, WFP was there. And I said that generally we look at the achievements which can be counted in terms of numbers, but we don't realize the achievements that you averted starvation deaths. So you deserve a Nobel Prize. And after 3 or 4 months, I got a call from Rome that, yes, what you had mentioned that we should get a Nobel Prize, and WFP was given a Nobel Prize. So idea is that kind of commendable work which had taken place during pandemic, which had come after 100 years. So we are a bit better geared up, but then the onslaught of climate change is hurting us day by day. So that requires moving towards and giving a push to the, say, millets are such crops which are climate resistant and health-wise also very good, low glycemic index, help the small farmers, require much lesser resources. So this is one area where India had taken initiative, and with the support of the G20 countries, with the support of the countries from Africa, 2023 was declared the year of millets. I think that momentum should not be lost. Now, in today's world, we are dependent upon a limited number of food grains. So we need to come out of that, because there may be a disease, a widespread disease, say, or a locust attack, say, on wheat. So that the kind of impairment which can take place across the globe will be very difficult to handle. Now, our investments remain very open. It has been spoken by the earlier speakers also. So a lot needs to be done at G20 fora and the multilateral agencies. And I feel that when we know that there are going to be countries which are going to be having, say, food deficit, say, next year. We may not be able to point out, but broadly which countries are going to have, we may not be able to point out by how many million tons. But do they have credit facilities from international organizations? So maybe the numbers may change by 30, 40, 20% due to volatility of production. But still, there should be arrangements of credit at reasonable terms so that these countries can approach the agencies and get credit, so that the food suppliers are also assured that, yes, they can provide. And at the same time, the investments into these countries for long-term higher production is equally important. Next. Now, one area where we need to focus is, and I think this is my last slide, R&D remains very important, especially for the varieties, especially for the diseases which occur when we move across the world. And to be very frank, if we go into genomes and the genetic material, I was going through some genetic materials in Africa today also. the list was very exciting, that some things can be adopted by the rest of the world, rather than thinking that, yes, this can be done for Africa, but Africa is a repository of many such genomes. Lastly, South-South cooperation, as well as triangular cooperation, including on technology, is now essential. It was never that much essential as it is today. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you, Dr. Anant. And then, I mean, there's some interesting points. The importance of millets, climate resilience. We need to rethink some of our crop production, and also some of the points that you've made around food safety nets, genomes, and global granaries. I hope we'll have a little bit of time. I know colleagues are posting a lot of questions, and it's great. We're going to get to them. We're now right down to the last two speakers. We're going to end the session with two very good lady friends of mine, Ruchita Berry, who's the Senior Research Associate and Center Coordinator for Africa, Latin America, and the UN Center at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses, also a long-standing partner of SIA. It's good to have you. And then we'll move on to China and Professor Chuanhong Zhang, who's joining us from New York. Ruchita, if you can keep it tight. I know it's unfortunate that you guys are coming up at the last bit, but I'd like to have a little bit of time for Q&A, as we've got quite a lot of comments in the chat. Thanks. Over to you, Ruchita.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for inviting me for this very important discussion on food insecurity in Africa. It is, and I agree with the previous speakers, especially Tandika, when she points out that the main drivers of food insecurity in Africa today are four. That is conflict. One, because it is nearly 80% of the people in the continent are facing food insecurity, are located in conflict-affected countries. And conflict has a detrimental effect on food production, as farmland and surrounding rural areas often become conflict epicenters. But research also says that food insecurity can contribute to violent conflict too. So, you know, it works both ways. Similarly, I think it's important to note that that climate change is also a heavy burden for Africa, and the fact that the UNEP has identified Africa as a region which is most vulnerable to climate change adds to the food insecurity in Africa. Third, the COVID pandemic obviously has exacerbated these challenges, fueling conflict and worsening the food insecurity. The pandemic also sharpened the societal divisions, which endanger the social cohesion within the continent. And finally, the Ukraine-Russia conflict has compounded the problems in terms of food security for African countries even further. More than 20 countries imported about 90% of their wheat, produced from Russia and Ukraine. So obviously, it did impact these countries a lot when the conflict broke out between Russia and Ukraine, and Russia used food as a weapon. So weaponizing food had an adverse impact on a number of food importers across the world, including those in Africa. So now, what is the solution for this? And I agree with Dr. Miyake that unfortunately the problem is more political than technical. There are several solutions and plans which are already in place in Africa, but it's to some extent it's the African leaders, reticence in terms of prioritizing food security, which may have impacted this kind of situation. So in terms of plans, there is the Maputo Declaration on Agriculture and Food Security in Africa, which was which is goes back to 2003, where the first commitment to allocation of at least 10% of national budgetary resources to agriculture was made. And the 2014 Malabo Declaration reaffirmed this commitment. Similarly, food self-sufficiency is an important goal under the Agenda 2063 of African Union Vision for the continent's future development. So despite all these plans, which promise to make agriculture a priority, there's a varying degree of progress within the continent, and only 1/3 of the countries are doing well. And Rwanda is the sole country at the moment which is on track in terms of achieving Malabo goals. So I agree with the previous speakers that addressing these concerns, these problems of food insecurity, cannot be left to the African countries themselves, because as has been pointed out, the debt burden that the African countries are facing, they are currently unable to deal or provide the extra investment needed for agricultural food self-sufficiency. So therefore, collaboration with the international community is definitely something which is the need of the hour. So in this context, I propose that African countries need to enhance their cooperation with India. India has been a long-standing development partner of Africa, and food security and agriculture have always been a top priority area. And moreover, I mean, looking back into India's civilizational history, sharing food is a concept which goes back to ancient Indian traditions, where food was equated to God. And there's a saying which said in Hindi, I'm going to say that and translate, that "Main bhi bhuka na rahu, sadhu na bhuka jaye," that, if I have a visitor at home, then I would try my best to provide him with food, and so that nobody goes hungry. So this kind of tradition at the individual level goes on at the between communities and countries at large in India from the ancient times. So now the question is, how can India and Africa collaborate? Historically, Africa and India had a lot of differences in terms of the fact that a large number of African countries are a net food importer, while India is a net exporter of food. But India and Africa is a continent, and India is a country. So how can you compare the two? But the fact is that India is also continent size in terms of population. Its population is actually higher than the combined population of Africa put together. So there is a possibility of, so I'm just presenting a case for why India and Africa should cooperate. But many would be surprised to note that in the 60s, Africa was actually food sufficient. And at that time, India was not. So today, India is one of the major food exporters in the world. So this presents, lessons. The Indian experience presents lessons for the African countries. While Africa has different countries, India's experience is also varied, with each state within the India as a whole offering different examples. So the African countries can pick up success stories and practices which would suit them well. A lot has already happened in this sphere, but more can happen. And traditionally, India has supported African countries in amplifying the African voices and concerns at various multilateral forums. Dr. Anand was talking about the G20 presidency, and which will always be remembered as a catalyst in terms of reshaping the mindsets of developed nations and integrating the aspirations of Global South, particularly Africa, into the mainstream through the inclusion of African Union as the 21st member of G20. So the Indian efforts denote the recognition of significance and potential of Africa as a development partner. And I hope these efforts would multiply in future. So I'll stop here, Elizabeth. I hope I was brief as you had said, and you have much more time for the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruchita. I think an interesting, point that you raised about India being not food sufficient in the 60s and Africa being food sufficient, and obviously there are a number of lessons, and I know that India-Africa cooperation and agriculture, there's also been a number of initiatives there. Let me move on now to Professor Zhang. Clearly, this is agriculture, food securities has always been one of the primary areas of cooperation between China and Africa. But none better than Professor Zhang to talk to us about this. She's from the China Agricultural University. She's the director of the Center for International Development Aid Studies, among other things. So thanks for joining us from New York, Chong Hong. Over to you.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you for your kind invitation. And it's my great honor to join this distinguished panel and to discuss this very important topic. As a Chinese scholar, following the topic for more than a decade, I'm always confused by the root causes of Africa's food insecurity. As we all know, compared with China, Africa has rich land resources, but the average yield of crop production is only about half of the world average. At the same time, we can also witness the large-scale and advantageous production system of such cash crops in Africa, such as my study area in Tanzania, size of production is very advanced with a very complete value chain. Cashew nuts production in Mozambique, and the different kinds of wines and chocolate in Madagascar. So, of course, my first question is to say, why is this? Of course, this is related to insufficient infrastructure and investment in staple crops such as maize, rice, wheat, and cassava. But these are not root causes. The root causes, I think, are the colonialism and its legacy reflected and continued now in the global trade system and the value chains. We know during the colonial period, Africa's agriculture sector is dominated by the cash crop, and the main objective is to meet the demand of the former colonizers. After independence, the legacy was inherited and continued by the world trade system and the international financial institutions established by the Western countries. I think this is one of the main causes of the food insecurity. This is my first point, and this also to repeat what Julius has said, how to grow what you eat and eat what you grow is very important for Africa. Then my second question is, what are the new actors, especially the emerging economies, can play in addressing the issues of African food insecurity? I'm going to take China as an example. We can see there are three major features of China's engagement, particularly in my study area of aid, China's aid in African agriculture sector. The first feature is, focusing on technology transfer on staple crop production, such as rice, maize, and mushrooms. Second, of course, it is embedded in China's domestic experiences. China really provide high priority on food security, domestic food security, just as President Xi said, Chinese, the food of Chinese people must be held in the Chinese bowls. So that is very important. And third, to some extent, I think it is also to meet some strategic needs of China that is more popular, known as the win-win or mutual benefit principles under the framework of South-South cooperation. But this does not mean China's support to Africa's staple food crop can directly to meet China's own food security demand. The logic is that as the largest importer of global grains, the Africa's self-sufficiency in staple crop will definitely benefit China, as the price from the global market might be slower if Africa imported less grains. And third, China's trade Africa in agriculture sector has been increasing in the last few years. Africa has been experiencing trade surplus in agriculture products with China. So this is the only sector I think we can see the trade surplus happening between China and Africa cooperation. And then the third question is how this engagement has been influenced by or will influence the geopolitics. I also talked to a few points. First, I think there are a lot of myths about China's engagement in Africa agriculture. This is influenced by the changing dynamics of geopolitics. First, many Western media reported that China is a global land grabber. According to the Western media report, China grabbed more than 6 million hectares of African land. But this is refuted by the Western academics, scholars themselves. According to a research by Carey of Johns Hopkins University, Chinese companies only acquired about 250,000 hectares of land in Africa. So this is the first myth. The second, China's investment in Africa is dominated by state-owned companies. That is also called state capitalism. But according to data of MOFCOM, China, it revealed that by the end of 2020, more than 3,500 enterprises have invested in Africa for over $43 billion, covering more than 50 African countries, ranking as the fourth largest investor. But more than 70% of these companies actually are private companies. Yeah, the third one, China's purpose to invest in African agriculture is to meet China's own demand. I had explained this in the previous points. So without doubt, these myths were fabricated due to the geopolitical competition happening these days. There are two consequences of this competition. One, from the positive side, we can say the competition to some extent can be good for Africa to exert its own agency, right? Africa can have more options, have more rights to choose its partners, to choose which one is more beneficial to them. But there are some negative sides as well. The new partners will be discouraged, like China. China was frustrating in investing, whether we should increase more investment in Africa agriculture. And should we give up the opportunity to invest if we think about the high risks of investment? And also, this will leave those countries without strategic values behind. The regional conflicts, disruptions, as mentioned by Elizabeth earlier, just like the poly crisis, disrupted the global supply chain, as well as the climate change, made the situation of Africa's food security even worse. The next question is, what is the reality of China's engagement in African agriculture? I have been following many cases, I learned that quite a few cases are quite successful in improving partner countries' food security, like the rice projects in Mozambique, Madagascar, Tanzania, and the Jinshao. Jinshao means mushroom grass. I don't know if you have ever heard it. And the mushroom projects in Rwanda, the China FAO, Uganda rice and fish symbiosis projects Yeah, these projects have greatly improved the local production capacity and food security. However, there are also many projects that are facing the challenge of, negative impacts. Being barred by the cultural, institutional, and even infrastructural barriers. And there are different partners are engaging African agriculture, including our university. If I still have some time, I would like to introduce you to one of the cases our team has been working in the past 10 years. That's a main production projects in Tanzania for more than 10 years. The project focuses on technology transfer to smallholder farmers in Tanzania through sharing China's domestic experiences. The project is named as Small Technology, Big Harvest. We call it small because it does not require high capital input, and it focuses on smallholder farmers using simple technology transfer that can be copied and expanded. These simple technologies include just land preparation, density increasing, improved seeds, weeding, all those kind of very simple technologies. But just by adopting these small technologies, the yield of the production can be increased by 2 to 3 times, and the cost of the project was a minimum. Just like the project provides some improved seeds, small amount of fertilizers, and the planting ropes. Of course, to encourage the farmers to adopt these technologies, we organize some competition between farmers. If you perform well, we would like to reward you a bicycle or a motor bicycle to the local extensionists. So this is what we are doing in the past 10 years. But since 2022, we started to encourage the local people to do intercropping of maize and soybeans. We call this new product small beans, good nutrition. By intercropping, the income of the local farmers can be increased, and the nutrition of the local people can be improved, as locals have started to drink soy milk. Yeah, they even learned how to do soy milk processing. And they in a very creative way, they put their local spices into the soy milk. As we know, soy milk is rich in plant protein. This can increase the local people's nutrition and solving the problem of nutrition. The project has been rewarded as one of the best practice projects by the UN. Nowadays, small yet beautiful projects like this one have been greatly encouraged and supported by Chinese government. That means in the future, we are going to have more such kind of projects, small yet beautiful projects in Africa to just focus on smallholder farmers to meet their own food security. To conclude, I think, as the largest South-South cooperation provider, China has always been prioritizing agricultural cooperation with Africa, but there is still a lot to be done to make the cooperation more fruitful and more mutual beneficial. We think, the reciprocity is very important, is the key for equal cooperation and to provide more ownership to our African partners. This is my personal points, and very simple. I hope it makes sense. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Great, thanks, Chang-Hong. Some very good examples. There is an interest from somebody in the chat. If you'll see in the chat, they want more information on the Tanzania project. Perhaps you can send some information or exchange emails in that regard. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got about 15 minutes, and and I know everybody probably thinks they've been inundated with a lot of information, but I think some really great points that have come out of it. My colleague Luanda, who I also need to recognize for having really driven this webinar and pulled it together, is trying to group them. And we're going to ask a couple of questions. We're not going to be able to answer all of them. What I would suggest is that the panelists also look at the Q&A section, and where possible, type the answers where appropriate, where there are particular questions for you. Professor Jang, there are a couple of questions for you as well. Before I ask Luanda maybe to just come in and sort of identify a couple of questions we want covered, I actually want to pose a geopolitical question or a comment. The first one, or two of them. The first one really relates to the position that South Africa and many other countries on the continent have taken around the geopolitical fragmentation and contestation. And the approach is that we believe we need to be non-aligned. We need to be able to engage with this side and with that side, and that guarantees our best interests. A lot of the discussion today highlights some of the difficulties of those positions, particularly if you're dependent on a single country, or largely on a single country for commodities, for certain products, and then these are weaponized. I mean, that's the one. So I'd like your comments, not necessarily from everybody, but certainly perhaps from some of my African colleagues on the panel. It would be good to have your views on that. And then perhaps I'm going to pose a question to India, or to Indian colleagues, and here specifically touch on the issue of export bans on rice and the impact that has had on the price of rice over the last sort of 7 or 8 months. Now, I understand that was not for geopolitical reasons, but clearly for very domestic reasons. But I mean, that has had a significant impact on a number of African countries that rely on, that import a lot of rice. So perhaps two questions. One, which are really about prices being elevated as a result of closing down of markets, and then how do we play this non-alignment game in the African context? Luanda, do you want to pose a couple of questions from going through the chat to our panelists specifically, so that each one doesn't try to answer everything?
Absolutely, Elizabeth. Maybe it's just to preface by saying some of the questions that were posed were then answered by the subsequent speakers that came on. So I'm not going to focus on those, but I just selected a couple that cover different themes within the concept of food insecurity that we're discussing today. So perhaps two questions for Dr. Mayaki. The first one is the question of South Africa's role in the G20. Has it taken any strong actions on global food security? And perhaps there, Dr. Mayaki can reflect on how there can be coordination between Brazil and South Africa, given the presidencies in the G20. The second question is really about climate change and how does it feature in the CAADP framework, and how can these be better integrated at national levels? To Thandeka, we have a participant that's questioning the factors of geoeconomics and how this confronts Africa. I'm sure this was covered in your intervention, but maybe just to say, how do these differ in the sub-regions within Africa? So, for example, SADC and ECOWAS, if there are any differences at all. Dr. Anand, there's the question of digitization and how the use of digitization, for example, can be used to transform small-scale farming. And there was another question that was very similar to that about the potential use of social media. Can social media be an effective tool in this regard? Elizabeth, I'd like to leave it there for now, noting that you've given the panelists an opportunity to respond to the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. So should we start with Dr. Mayaki, then move on to Thandeka, and then on to Dr. Anand? And if we have any time, if Professor Jang, you want to come in on any of the questions, obviously free to.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to answer to a question of the G20. As you all know, the G20 has several pathworks with a certain level of complexity. regarding food security path work, what the African Union is doing is to enhance what we call the common African position on food systems. So just a very small explanation on how this common African position has been defined. Before the UN Food Systems Summit 3 years ago, there was a national dialogue in 49 African countries. The national dialogue was organized, bottom-up process, in order to have farmers, private sector, public policy makers interact on what would be the best national pathways, illustrating a food systems transformation approach. Well, the difference between, the added value of a food systems approach, but it is that it is integrated. It brings in infrastructure, trade, human capital development issues, nutrition, etc. So that these national pathways were synthesized in a common African position that was then brought to the UN Food Systems Summit. And by the way, Africa was the only region in the world which came with a common African position regarding food systems. And this is that common African position that we are pushing within the G20. It started when India was chairing. Now it continues with Brazil. And regularity and continuity is one of the best ways to achieve the goals within this forum. At the same time, I am part of the G7 working group. I'm invited to a G7 working group on food security. And in that forum, I also enhance the same issues which are related to the common African position on food systems. And we don't have time maybe to go into the details of a common African position on food systems, but three critical pillars: integration, reduction of our food import bills, and fundamentally, all the issue of financing. And financing here is linked to also climate financing. Many instruments are being developed in order to move towards that. And let's remember again, we have a common African position on climate, which was framed in Nairobi with specific instruments of financing. So we do that harmonization the best way we can. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it responds to the question regarding G20, but it's okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, great. Thank you, Dr. Mayaki. Thandeka? Thandeka? Yes.
Okay, good afternoon. So the question on geoeconomic fragmentation, I saw it in the chat. I think that this question of fragmentation is, and I think Dr. Mayaki brought it up in terms of his answer about the necessity for regional integration, is one of the most critical issues facing the continent right now. In terms of there are 8 recognized regional economic communities within the African Union framework, and there are great discrepancies between them all. Probably in terms of integration, the highest body integrated is the East African Community, the EAC, and ironically, the lowest is SADC, our beloved region in Southern Africa. And then in between there's a vast array of discrepancies in terms of levels of integration. Having said that, the question of that this is squarely a question that's important. I think it's no accident, bringing it back to our topic today, that in 2022, the AU named our theme of the year, within the African Union framework as the year of nutrition. And the next year, 2023, the theme of the year was enhancing the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And I don't think that's accidental. There was a logic in pairing the two in terms of looking at models of integration and how to deepen the regional value chains with respect in particular to questions of food security. So that's just, I'm hoping to sort of answer it. I know we don't have time, but if I want to just throw in one quick answer to the question of China versus India with respect to Africa, I couldn't resist, because I don't know if colleagues will remember, those who read, I remember it was Foreign Affairs, and there was a question posed just a year ago, is India the new China in Africa? And there was a question mark because it's still an unresolved issue. But I think they're different models, and it's very interesting for us to sort of explore and deepen, perhaps at a later date, the differences in approach with sort of China's major push in terms of infrastructure development and how that had a sort of resonance on the continent versus the Indian approach in terms of human resource development in other sectors. So I don't think India is the new China yet because of the type of approach, but we don't know what the future holds. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Thandeka. Dr. Anand?
First start with the so-called ban, which was actually not a ban. If you read the language of the notification, exports were routed, had to be done through government channels directly. An individual, say retailer or wholesaler, could not buy, say, 50,000 tons and export to any country. So that was the kind of, I'll use the word restriction. Now let me take you to a counterfactual. Suppose India required 5 million tons to import. If India is not in a position to, say, export 1 million ton and prices rise by, say, X, vis-a-vis if India has to import 5 million tons, prices will shoot, say, 2x, by 2x, say, instead of 5% will shoot by, say, 10% or 15%. The genesis why what had happened was that in our grain-rich states of Punjab and Haryana, the wheat crop had shivered. We could see the grain, but that kind of pith was not there in the grain. And there were estimates which were ranging between, say, 95 million tons to 100 million tons of wheat during that year, against the earlier estimates of 105 million tons. Thanks to the large kind of stocks which we have for our public distribution system, so we can always overcome one such bad year. But yes, if suppose there are 2 bad years, then what should we all do? That we all need to sit down and look into. I come to the second question on digitalization. When India started doing a lot of digitalization of small farmers, pandemic was not on the horizon. I recall it was in 2015-16, I was in government, and number of accounts were being opened, and unique ID, including all the 10 fingers and iris. So that was Aadhaar and mobile telephony. So question arises that what made it so successful? What is one factor which made it so successful? That factor was that uniqueness, a person's ID. Even today, when a child of 5-year age is recovered who has lost it 1 year back, so they try to link with, say, DNA. But if suppose a child is 6-year-old, it is mandatory now in India that a child at the age of 5 has biometrics done. Then at the age of 14 to 15, a second biometrics is done. So that uniqueness gives credibility and assurance that yes, when we are talking to Mr. X, we are actually talking to Mr. X. So that had a lot of impact. When COVID came, what happened that bank accounts were linked. And because bank accounts were linked, suppose something was to be done on inputs, something else was to be done, or some advisory was to be given on mobile telephony. So this trinity of, say, we call it, say, public accounts, Jan Dhan Yojana J, Aadhaar, unique ID, and mobile telephony. So that came to rescue, and it can be adopted. And we have, in fact, we have shared many of our platforms with, and we are always happy to share. And I'm sorry, I forgot to tell at the time of my PPT that it's all for the part, whosoever you want to share with the participants, please feel free and you can share with all the participants. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, and of course, that was one of the big priorities in the G20 presidency, also the digital public infrastructure and the India stack and so on, which is and I think there's been a lot of collaboration with African countries, in some African countries, to roll that out. I saw that Chuang Hong had her screen on. Is there any last minute comments you want to make?
Yeah, there are so many questions, and I cannot address each and every of them. But
no,
I just want
keep it short.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. When I talk about this competition and the negative impact of the competition, I think I really want to emphasize the African agency. That means African ownership. African countries, partners are the one who hold the magic wand, right? It's up to you to decide which sector you can collaborate with China, collaborate with India, collaborate with traditional partners. So that's very important. And according to China's policy, it's written in our policy, especially concerning China's aid in Africa, it's based on demand driven. That means if you do not demand this aid, we will not impose our conditionalities on you. So that is very important. And the other one is we are trying to repeat the mistakes, that the former colonizers has made by importing more cash crop products from African continent. I think that that is the trend. Of course, China is the largest market. We import a lot of products, right? And we won't import rice from Africa, but we also need cashew, cocoa, all those kind of products from Africa. So how I think Africa still has a great potential to expand your land resources. You need to really focus on your domestic food security while to be cautious about those cash crops. So that is very important. Let the market to do what they can do, but the government, how they can function more effectively to serve the local people's food security, to meet the demand of local people's needs. That is very important. And the last one is about the Tanzania projects. There are quite a lot of reports. Please provide my email to them if they're interested. We can talk more later. Thank you, Elizabeth. That's all about my contribution. Okay.
Great. Thanks, Chuang Hong. Anything from you, Ruchita, just before we close?
Yeah, just one point. Basically, regarding your question on the ban on rice import, the Dr. Anand has already clarified that it was not a ban. And moreover, the important point to look at is that it was only restrictions on one particular variety of rice export. India exports basmati, non-basmati white rice, parboiled rice, broken rice. There are various varieties of rice that India exports, and this particular variety which we were talking about was the non-white, non-basmati white rice, and a number of African countries were importing this. But so I don't think India had banned the complete set of rice exports, and nor did it to do it it was not a ban. It was just a restriction of different way of exporting. And secondly, there were other varieties available for countries to procure from India through the traditional methods. Thank you.
No, great. Thanks, Ruchita. Okay, it's been, I think there's been a lot put on the table, a lot of things to reflect on. I think some more, as we saw in the Q&A. But let me ask Oliver if he wants to come in and just make some concluding remarks.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. I don't want to add to the discussion as we've already run out of time. I was absolutely fascinating, a great deal to reflect on. I've taken a large number of notes, and I'm enormously grateful to everyone for their participation and to you for moderating the session.
No, great. Thanks. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who have stayed the course, thank you very much. We will be producing some material related to this. Some of it will also be on the Project for Peaceful Competition website. And this recording, of course, will also be on YouTube. We're also probably going to extract a couple of quotes and things and put them on our social media. Very big thank you to all our panelists, Dr. Mayaki, Professor Nkiwani, Professor Jang, Ruchita Berry, Dr. Anand, and of course, Jules Amoti, who had to leave a little earlier. Thank you very much for making the time and for really making this a very rich discussion. And again, a big thank you to Luanda Mpangosi from my side, who has helped to put this all together. And of course, to Oliver Letwin and his team. Great. Thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much.
Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you.